The Unetaneh Tokef prayer was written by Rabbi Amnon of Mainz in the 11th century, according to the story. In that story, Rabbi Amnon is pressured by the Archbishop of Mainz to recant his Judaism, and the rabbi says that he will go away and consider it for a few days. When he returns a few days later, he asks the Archbishop to cut his tongue out for ever having even considered giving up his Judaism. And the Archbishop is so frustrated, according to the story, that instead of cutting out his tongue, he cuts off his hands and feet instead. And it's said that Rabbi Amnon wrote this prayer, the Unetaneh Tokef prayer, which we recite on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that he wrote it as a way of expressing the horror of life, the fact that we can be faced with so much difficulty not knowing who will live and who will die. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, contemporary rabbi, notes that the Unetaneh Tokef prayer is very passive. God writes, and then God seals our fate. And yes, she notes that Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, these things are our active part. It says, Uteshuvah, Utefillah, Utzedakah, Ma'avirinet Roa HaGazera, that atonement and prayer and charity can avert the evil decree. So we do have an active role, but in some sense, as Rabbi Danya says, it's all predetermined unless we intervene. And Rabbi Danya notes that for the Jews of Mainz, this was not just something that God decreed, but something that people decreed. The terrible fate of the Jews in Mainz, who were then expelled from the city, from the area, they recognized that this wasn't God, this was people. And so Rabbi Danya has written an extraordinary modern version of Unetaneh Tokef, which he says similarly shows the horror of what can be done by people who decide who will live and who will die, with what they consider to be just laws, but actually are laws that are extremely harmful. And so she has written a version of Unetaneh Tokef, which I would like to share with you today. Who will live and who will die? Who by fire and who by water? Who by ectopic pregnancy? And who by infection after her water broke? Who pushed into poverty, and who denied the chance to escape poverty? Who now trapped in an abusive relationship, and who now murdered by her abuser? Who disabled by a pregnancy they didn't want? Who disabled by birth they didn't want? Who irreparably harmed by being forced to stay pregnant without regard for her disabled body? Who forced into dysphoria? And who forced into ICE detention? Who by systemic racism? Who by incarceration? Who stripped of dignity? Who stripped of agency? Who stripped of autonomy? Who by trauma? Who by trauma? Who by death? And who by trauma? Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah cannot save them all. Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah cannot save us all, but it can lessen the severity of the decree. People did this, not God. Teshuvah, when we face the harm of this decision and take steps to reverse course, when we pass legislation to protect and expand access, we can chart a new future. Activism and advocacy must get us there. Tefillah, when we connect to the source of our humanity, our empathy, our understanding, we remember that we must always show up for one another, that we are not any of us free while injustice rages outside our door. We must not get numb to suffering. We must not scroll by. We must keep our hearts open. In tzedakah, we must share resources as we can, funding travel across state lines, funding abortion care, supporting the people on the front lines doing what they can to support all who need, who deserve abortion care. We can take action this year to inscribe more people for safety, for dignity, for wholeness, for the chance to write their own lives. So much still hangs in the balance. Rabbi Danya's piece is an extraordinary piece. And she has rewritten the Unetaneh Tokef prayer, shared a new version of this prayer to remind us that our prayers during the High Holy Day season must always remain relevant to us, that they can't be relics of the past, that they must speak to us today, change us today, remind us not to be callous, not to consider ourselves so wonderful that we only need to change small aspects of ourselves. Our prayer and our action must be connected. And that's the essence of the 10 days of penitence, of these extraordinary 10 days when we really reflect on our prayers and ask ourselves, do I behave in the way that I pray? That synchronization of ourselves, of our inner self and our outer self, of our acting self and our prayer self, is what these 10 days is all about. I encourage you to join us for our Shabbat Shuvah services, where we celebrate Shabbat but also pause and reflect on ourselves, on trying to bring ourselves together in a unified whole, trying to make our prayer self our real self, the person who we believe we are, helping that become the person we actually are. And part of that is through reflection on our ancient prayers and on our contemporary prayers. So I invite you to join us, particularly on Shabbat morning, during our Torah study, where instead of looking at the Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, this week we're going to look at the extraordinary liturgy that our members wrote for this year's High Holy Day services. And of course, I invite you to join us for our Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur services next week as well. So I wish you a Shabbat of unification, a Shabbat of unifying your prayer self with your real world self. And I hope that you'll join us in prayer and in action this week and in the coming weeks. I wish you Shabbat Shalom.